Welcome to BEARTH Podcast. I'm Ash. Today I want to introduce you to my friend Nathan Thompson. He's a journalist, a writer, and a poet. We met a little over a year ago in Thailand, and we bonded over enjoying some of the same authors. But there was a time in his life that was far more complex, where the authors that he enjoyed inspired him from a place of addiction rather than of purpose. I want to take you into our conversation as we reminisce a little bit about some of our favorite authors and how he became a heroin and cocaine addict. He eventually, of course, overcomes those things. We'll talk about that too. But take a moment and listen in. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, pleasure.
We met in Thailand, right? We met in Chiang Mai. At that little Aussie cafe.
Yeah, Overstand Cafe.
Yeah, Overstand Cafe in Chiang Mai.
Yeah.
And you guys were there on a vacation, right? You and your wife?
I can't even remember. Oh, I think we were there for a wedding.
Okay. Well, I was sitting there and I was basically just doing some work and just having a cup of coffee, and I'm not even sure how the conversation got started. But I think that you've acknowledged it before, but we sort of bonded when we started talking about the beatnik authors, so Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, those who might not know William Burroughs, and we sort of both have a great appreciation for their writing and their work, and
definitely.
Which was interesting to me to like find another person who's so prevalently finds their work inspiring as well. So I guess I'll start with a question: is when did you first start reading them, and just give me a little bit of background on how you got into some of their work,
well,
how that inspires you as a writer.
I really want to mention Bill Hicks at this point, because I really feel like he should be lumped in with those guys, even though he's obviously like completely different time frame. He seems to be saying, talking from the same hymn book in a way. So I think for me, I was drawn to guys like Bill Hicks and the Beats. I'm not really sure how I first got in touch with them. I think it's because I was kind of a bit obsessed with drugs, and I was obsessed with writing. So obviously I went for any writer that was also into drugs. And it also so happens that writers that were into drugs are also writers that are from the alternative tradition. They're sort of usually coming from the outside, or they have counterculture politics, or so. And I was into all the different types of drugs and psychedelics and stuff like that. And I think I read Kerouac first, and I didn't read Burroughs until I was in my early 20s, which is probably a good thing, because I don't think I really would have understood a lot of his stuff when I was a kid. But like, I remember On the Road is pretty clear cut what that's about. And also Hunter S. Thompson does this to an extent where it's like they don't shy away from the dark, grotesque, awful side of humans, but at the same time they completely electrify it with this energy that makes it not depressing. It makes it really kind of thrilling. So it's all, and I feel like maybe Bill Hicks has a similar thing where he shines a light on the dark side of humanity, but he's doing it at the same time as telling jokes, So for me, it was about, I don't know, maybe there's a sort of way of looking at the dark side, but in a way that doesn't completely depress you or freak you out or something.
You've read all of these books, and you kind of went from understanding that, it was just sort of drugs and darkness of story, to understanding sort of the relevance of their human condition and what they were actually doing, sort of expressing their pain. How do you feel that's inspired you in your own work, and as well as your own transformation in life?
In terms of my own writing, because I sort of was a heroin addict, and I was coming out of that, I looked into people who were writing about it, and just sort of, I guess, tried to emulate them. I just sort of wrote the stories I did, and I think the process has been, when I first started writing them, it was more kind of about the depravity and the drug porn side of things. Partly because in those days it was kind of a vicarious high for me to write about it, and I was sort of getting kind of high while I was doing it. But then when I sort of got over that kind of need to be vicariously high by writing about drugs and reading about drugs, I was able to like look at other elements of the story, like characters and plots, and it's not just like just drug porn. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Uh, Talk about, you mentioned being a heroin addict. Talk about that for a moment.
Um, well, it was a time in my life when I was just in a lot of pain, so I just sort of self-medicated. It was a complicated thing. It was a confluence of lots of different, like, troublesome elements, sort of all coming together. Some of them people would recognize as sort of depression, but also a sense of like grandiosity, narcissism, take your pick. Obviously, depression was there. Um, Anger, a lot of anger, like, and not very well expressed anger, not being able to express my emotions. So it was all a bit of a perfect storm. So, I mean, I'm not a fan of the idea of calling addiction a disease. I think it's better to expressed as a conglomeration of behavioral and psychological issues. And I think it's probably different for each person, but there's always it's sort of like this sort of you just get to a place where your own head is such a horrible place to be. You just need to get out of it. And
Mhm.
then obviously taking the drugs makes you do things, immoral things, stealing, lying, etc., which then makes you feel guilty, and then your head is an even more horrible place to be, and then you need to take more drugs, and then then you're in this sort of vicious circle by that point.
You talk about it being a conglomerate of, pain, maybe depression, anger, and narcissism. And narcissism right now is sort of shooting through the roof in conversation among people who are trying to understand it. There's a clinical psychologist I listen to, Dr. Ramani, who discusses the fact that it's actually not necessarily a diagnosis, but it's a descriptive word. But she also believes that it's sort of the epidemic of the human condition right now, because as a society, we sort of endorse it, we reward it on significant levels. Um, you know, Talk a bit about, maybe can you expand for you what felt like maybe a sense of entitlement or frustration or pain that led you to feel the need to that was part of your maybe your repertoire when it came to doing heroin, when it came to doing drugs, into sort of engaging in the expression of your addiction.
I mean, it's quite hard to say with sort of accuracy what I was actually feeling and going through at that time, because um, it wasn't pure narcissism, because I actually really did have genuine pain. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was genuinely, like, I look back on myself then and I have like compassion for that person, because I'd smoked so much weed. See, by that point, since I was 16, I was smoking like maybe 3 grams of, powerful skunk a day. I might have had like a few months off here and there, but mostly that. And that had screwed my brain to the point where I was like mildly psychotic all the time, but like in a very not fun way. So I would be completely paranoid all the time, in that sense that you think everyone's watching you. And I used to feel like people could see my thoughts, and it'd get to the stage where I would even be looking at how, like, be picking up secret messages on the TV by how people would jerk their head, and I would think they were trying to tell me something. So when you're like in that space, it's kind of really hard to sort of like separate out the narcissistic aspect of that, because obviously it's a fairly grandiose situation to find yourself in, where you think the TV is sending you personally messages and you're the only one who can actually work this out. You start to think like, oh, I'm either a genius or something's very wrong. But I never, I never got so far as to think I was a genius or anything. I just thought like, because I hated myself so much. I grew up a Christian, and then I sort of lost my faith when I was in my early teens. And I also got very, very angry um, at just what I felt was people trying to control me and stuff. And I think it might be what all teenagers go through, but I think for me, I just straight up hated authority, you know? Um, and that has sort of, that came from probably being raised in a very strict household, right? So it maybe came out when I was a teenager to just hate authority. So then anything they said I shouldn't do, I was going to do. So then obviously I do the drugs, and then I start going crazy, and then you combine those two things, and it's sort of then becomes a kind of um, like I say, a perfect storm. But I think another element from that is my one of my favorite phrases, moral turpitude, which is when, as a kid, you don't have enough money for the drugs, so then you start stealing off your parents, and then you start feeling guilty, you feel bad about yourself, um, you start lying, and you sort of lose touch with ethics and morality. And I sort of believe that ethics and morality are like a kind of spiritual force in the world for
Mm.
good, obviously. And if you're not in that space, you start going to a dark place, and then things get darker and darker, and you can't see the wood for the trees. And then all that equals a big load of pain. And then that's what you need to self medicate.
What was painful for you?
Well, like I said, um, the moral decay is felt in the subtle body, right? So in yogic terms, you have the physical body and the subtle body, which is the energy and to some extent the emotionality and all the subtle experiences that you have that maybe have a name or don't have a name. That was perhaps say ablaze with the effects of the unhealthy lifestyle I was living. So then it became necessary to shut it down.
It took time for Nathan to overcome his addiction, and in the next episode, we'll talk about that as well. I hope that this was a good introduction for you, and I hope that you'll keep listening, because I think it's an important conversation for us to begin to look at our own addictions. It may not be drugs for some people, it may be something else, but it's important for us to weed out the very thing that we use to cope with our pain, and how we use it, how we are with that thing. I once heard Jada Pinkett Smith say that it's not necessarily the thing, it's how you are with the thing. And the truth is, a lot of us will do anything we can to control the narrative and hide whatever pain we are in. So maybe it's food, maybe it's exercise, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's substances, maybe it's parties, maybe it's even religion. Maybe none of those things are really terrible on the surface, but if we're using them in such a way that is aiming to cope with something, to be an answer, a ticket out of something, rather than actually facing our pain, rather than facing the grief within our bodies, within our souls, then maybe we need to reevaluate. For now, I'll leave you there, and we'll continue on next time. May you live and move and have your being. Cheers.